Have you ever experienced something you just couldn't explain? In this video, we'll explore eerie stories of paranormal encounters that leave more questions than answers. Could these encounters be real, or are we just imagining things? We may never know. I don't talk about this often, not because I fear being mocked, but because every time I think about it, I feel that same dread creeping up my spine, the same sense of unreality that swallowed me whole that night. But if I don't tell it, it festers inside me, like something that refuses to die until it's acknowledged. So here it is. Do with it what you will. It was the summer of 2004. I had just moved to a small town in the Pacific Northwest, the kind of place where the trees seemed older than time, and the mist hung thick in the morning air, curling around rooftops like spectral fingers. I was staying in an old rental house at the edge of town, a place that had been vacant for years before I moved in. The landlord had warned me about the usual: creaky floors, faulty wiring, drafts that made the windows rattle at night. But I didn't care. It was cheap, and I needed a fresh start. The first few weeks were uneventful. I spent my days at work and my evenings fixing up the house, getting rid of dust and cobwebs, trying to make the place feel like mine. It wasn't until late August that I started noticing things. Small, insignificant at first. My keys weren't where I left them. The television would be on when I was certain I had turned it off. I'd hear faint knocking sounds at night, but every time I checked, the house was empty. Then something changed. One evening, I came home to find every cabinet door in the kitchen wide open. My first thought was that someone had broken in, but nothing was missing. No signs of forced entry. I closed them all, trying to shake the unease crawling under my skin. Maybe I had left them open without realizing it. Maybe I was just tired. But then it happened again, and again. Always when I was alone. Always when I wasn't looking. One night, I decided to test it. I closed all the cabinets before bed, took pictures with my phone, and went to sleep with the door to my bedroom locked. I woke up to the sound of a single, distinct creak, like a footstep on old wood. My heart pounded as I grabbed my phone and checked the pictures. The cabinets had been closed when I went to bed. I stepped into the kitchen, barely breathing. Every cabinet door stood open. Then the whispers started. At first, I thought they were just tricks of my imagination, the way silence sometimes bends and warps in an empty house. But they grew persistent, murmuring just at the edge of perception, slipping into the stillness when I least expected it. Words I couldn't understand, spoken in a voice that didn't belong to me. One night, as I was brushing my teeth, I saw something in the mirror. Not behind me, not in the reflection of the room, but in my own eyes. A flicker of something dark, watching, waiting. The moment I blinked, it was gone, but I felt it, deep in my chest, a sensation like cold fingers curling around my ribs. A week later, while almost asleep, I saw a shadow at the end of my bed, so tall its head nearly brushed the ceiling. My breath caught in my throat, and for the longest time I couldn't move. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing it to be a trick of my imagination. But when I opened them again, it was still there, silent, motionless, watching. I don't know how long I lay there, paralyzed, before exhaustion finally won, dragging me into a fitful sleep. The next morning, I woke to find my bedroom door open, despite having locked it the night before. And then I saw them, faint, wet footprints, leading from the doorway to the side of my bed. They stopped just inches from where I had been sleeping. That was the last straw. I packed my bags in a blind panic, shoving whatever I could into my car. I didn't stop to think, didn't pause to take a final look. I locked the house behind me and drove away, leaving that place to whatever had been waiting in the dark. It happened during my time working at a 24-hour diner just outside Salem, Oregon. I've spent the last 5 years trying to find a logical explanation for what I experienced that morning, but I still can't make sense of it. I'm sharing this story now because I recently found out that the diner was demolished last month to make way for a new shopping center, and somehow that feels like a sign that it's finally time to talk about it. It was a Tuesday in March 2018, and I was working the early morning shift that started at 4 a.m. Anyone who's worked these hours knows there's something different about that time of day. It's not quite night anymore, but it's not really morning either. It's like the world exists in some kind of in-between state. Usually we'd get a few truckers stopping for coffee, maybe some early shift factory workers grabbing breakfast before their day started. That morning was unusually quiet. It had been raining steadily since midnight, and the parking lot was empty except for my car and our cook Miguel's old pickup truck. I was wiping down the counter for probably the 10th time when our first customer walked in. The bell above the door chimed at exactly 4:47 a.m. I remember checking the time because I'd been wondering if we'd have any customers at all that morning. The man who walked in was completely average in every way. He wasn't particularly tall or short, wasn't thin or heavy, and wore ordinary work clothes, jeans, boots, and a dark blue jacket. He could have been anywhere between 35 and 50 years old. The only thing that struck me as slightly odd was that despite the heavy rain outside, his clothes and hair were completely dry. He sat at the counter, 3 seats from the register, and ordered black coffee without looking at the menu. His voice was calm and natural, yet something about it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I couldn't place why at the time, but later I realized it was because his voice didn't echo at all in our tile-floored diner. It was like his words were somehow absorbed by the air around him. As I poured his coffee, I noticed something else strange. The steam from the coffee didn't rise naturally. It seemed to curl away from him, like there was some kind of invisible barrier pushing it back. I blinked hard, thinking my tired eyes were playing tricks on me, but the effect remained. Then came the incident that I still can't explain. The man reached for the sugar dispenser, and I saw his hand pass straight through it. Not like a ghost in a movie. There was no ethereal glow, no translucence. His hand looked completely solid, but it went through the glass dispenser as if it wasn't there. He seemed to notice his mistake, pulled his hand back slightly, and then reached again, this time grasping the dispenser normally. I must have made some small sound of surprise because he looked up at me then. His eyes were a perfectly normal brown color, but something about his gaze made my entire body go cold. It wasn't threatening or malevolent. It was more like looking into a deep well and suddenly realizing you can't see the bottom. That's when I noticed the silence. The diner was always full of small sounds. The hum of the refrigerators, the buzz of fluorescent lights, the slow drip of the coffee maker, the sizzle from Miguel's grill in the kitchen. But in that moment, everything went completely quiet. Not muffled, not distant, just absolutely silent, like someone had pressed a universal mute button on the world. The man continued looking at me for what felt like several minutes, but must have been only seconds. Then he smiled, a perfectly ordinary, polite smile, and said, "Thank you for the coffee." He placed a $5 bill on the counter and stood up to leave. The bill looked crisp and new, but when I picked it up later, the date on it was 1985. He walked to the door, and just before he pushed it open, all the sounds came rushing back, so suddenly that I jumped. The bell chimed as he left, and I hurried to the window to watch him go, but the parking lot was empty. There were no cars driving away, no one walking down the street, and the rain was still coming down as hard as ever. When I went back to the counter, his coffee cup was there, completely full and still hot, without a single fingerprint on its surface. The sugar dispenser he had reached for was knocked over, even though I hadn't seen it fall. But what really shook me was when I checked the security camera footage later that morning. The camera showed me standing at the counter, pouring coffee into a cup, and having what appeared to be a one-sided conversation with an empty seat. I asked Miguel if he had seen or heard anything unusual, but he had been in the walk-in freezer doing inventory. The regular customers who came in later that morning noticed nothing out of the ordinary, though Mrs. Henderson, who'd been coming in every morning for 20 years, did comment that the diner felt warmer than usual that day. Over the next few weeks, I tried to rationalize what had happened. Lack of sleep, stress, and overactive imagination, I considered every possible explanation, but none of them could account for the $5 bill from 1985, which I kept in my wallet until I lost it in a move 2 years later. I never saw the man again, and nothing similarly inexplicable ever happened during my remaining time at the diner. But that experience changed something in me. Sometimes, especially on rainy mornings, I catch myself watching how the steam rises from my coffee, half expecting it to curl away from an invisible barrier that isn't there. I don't claim to know what I experienced that morning. I'm not even sure I believe in ghosts or supernatural phenomena, but I know what I saw and, more importantly, what I felt. Maybe some experiences aren't meant to be explained. It was a quiet Tuesday evening, the kind of night where the world feels still, almost too still. I was driving home from work, the kind of late shift that leaves your eyes heavy and your mind foggy. The road was familiar, a winding stretch of asphalt that cut through dense woods, the kind of place where the trees seem to lean in closer, the darker it gets. I'd driven this route 100 times before, maybe more, and nothing about it had ever struck me as unusual. But that night, something felt off. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on at first, just a faint unease, like the quiet before a storm, the kind of feeling that makes you glance over your shoulder even when you know there's nothing there. I remember the exact moment it started. My radio, which had been playing softly in the background, suddenly crackled and went silent. Not the usual static, but a complete, dead silence. I tapped the dial, thinking it was just a glitch, but nothing happened. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move. It was quick, just a flicker of motion in the trees, but it was enough to make my heart skip a beat. I told myself it was probably a deer or some other animal, but deep down I knew it wasn't. The movement had been too deliberate, too human. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel and kept driving, trying to shake the feeling that I was being watched. The road ahead was empty, the kind of emptiness that feels unnatural in the middle of nowhere. No other cars, no lights, just the faint glow of my headlights cutting through the darkness. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard, 11:47 p.m. The numbers seemed to stare back at me, cold and unfeeling. I was about 10 minutes from home, but those 10 minutes felt like an eternity. That's when I saw it again. This time, it wasn't just a flicker. It was a figure standing at the edge of the woods, just far enough from the road to be shrouded in shadow. My breath caught in my throat as I slowed down, my instincts screaming at me to keep going, but my curiosity, or maybe my fear, holding me in place. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, perfectly still, like it was waiting for something, or someone. I couldn't make out any details, no face, no clothes, just a silhouette that seemed to blend into the darkness. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Maybe it was a person lost in the woods or someone playing a cruel prank. But something about the way it stood, the way it seemed to radiate an almost palpable sense of wrongness, made me doubt those explanations. I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck as I pressed down on the accelerator, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The rest of the drive was a blur. I kept my eyes glued to the road, my hands clenched so tightly around the steering wheel that my knuckles turned white. Every shadow, every rustle of leaves outside my window felt like a threat. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I was shaking. I sat there for a moment, staring at the familiar sight of my house, trying to convince myself that what I'd seen was nothing more than a trick of the light, a product of my tired mind. But deep down, I knew better. Something had been out there. Something that didn't belong. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure standing at the edge of the woods, watching me. The next morning, I tried to brush it off as a bad dream, but the memory was too vivid, too real. I told myself I'd never drive that road again at night, but life has a way of forcing you to confront your fears whether you want to or not. A week later, I found myself on that same stretch of road, this time earlier in the evening. The sun was just beginning to set, casting long shadows across the asphalt. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that there was nothing to be afraid of. But as I approached the spot where I'd seen the figure, I felt that same unease creeping back in. And then I saw it. Not a figure this time, but something else. A shape, hovering just above the tree line. It was hard to make out at first, but as I got closer, I realized it was a flock of birds, except they weren't moving. They were frozen in midair, their wings outstretched but completely still, like a photograph. My stomach churned as I slowed down, my eyes glued to the impossible sight. I rolled down my window, half expecting to hear the sound of their wings flapping, but there was nothing, just silence. I don't know how long I sat there staring at those birds, but eventually I forced myself to keep driving. As I passed beneath them, I glanced up, half expecting them to come crashing down on me, but they were gone. Just like that. No sound, no movement, just gone. I didn't tell anyone about what I'd seen. Who would believe me? Even now, years later, I still can't explain it. I've tried to rationalize it, to come up with some logical explanation, but there isn't one. Those birds shouldn't have been able to do what they did. They shouldn't have been able to just disappear. And that figure in the woods, I never saw it again, but I still feel its presence sometimes, like a shadow lingering at the edge of my vision. I don't drive that road anymore, not even during the day. Some things are better left unexplored. But the strangest part of it all, the part that still keeps me up at night, it's not the birds or the figure or even the silence. It's the feeling I had that night, the feeling that whatever I'd encountered wasn't just watching me, it was waiting. Waiting for something I can't even begin to understand. And sometimes in my darkest moments, I wonder if it's still out there, waiting still. It was one of those nights that felt heavier than it should have. You know the kind, when the air itself seems to press against your skin, and silence isn't truly silent, but rather filled with something unspoken. I had just left my sister's apartment, walking back to my car parked a block away. The street was empty except for the occasional glow of a television screen through a window and the muffled hum of a city winding down for the night. It wasn't too late, maybe 10 or 11, but something about that night made it feel much later, like time had stretched itself too thin. I was halfway down the sidewalk when I felt it. Not heard, not saw, felt. A presence. Something just behind me, just close enough to send a shiver crawling up my spine. I stopped walking and turned, expecting to see someone, maybe a neighbor stepping out for a cigarette, maybe a stray cat rustling through the bushes, but there was nothing. Just the empty street, lined with cars, their windshields reflecting the orange glow of the streetlights. The air was still, too still. The kind of stillness that makes your own breath feel intrusive. I told myself I was being ridiculous, shook off the unease, and kept walking. But then as I reached for my car door, I felt it again. A touch. Cold. Not the brush of wind, not the tickle of a stray hair against my neck. No, this was deliberate. The distinct pressure of fingers grazing the back of my arm. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't just cold, it was icy, like the kind of chill you feel when you've been outside in the dead of winter without gloves, except it was summer. I spun around so fast that I nearly lost my balance, heart hammering against my ribs, my eyes scanning every shadow, every possible place something could be hiding. But again, there was nothing. I stood frozen, my back pressed against the car, trying to make sense of what had just happened. A breeze, a muscle spasm. No. I knew what I felt. I knew the difference between a trick of the mind and the sensation of actual physical contact. I reached for my arm instinctively, half expecting to find a handprint left behind, some kind of proof that I wasn't losing my mind. But of course, there was nothing. Just my own skin, warm to the touch but still tingling from where the cold fingers had been. I got in the car and locked the doors. The moment I was inside, the feeling shifted. Not gone, just different. Less of a presence behind me, and more of a weight in the air, like something had decided to sit in the passenger seat, silent and watching. My hands trembled as I turned the key in the ignition, the engine roaring to life, the sound almost comforting in its normalcy. I told myself to look forward, to keep my eyes on the road, but I couldn't help it. I glanced at the rear-view mirror. Nothing. The drive home was a blur of streetlights and the dull sound of the radio playing too low to make out the words. I kept checking the mirror, half expecting to catch a glimpse of something that wasn't supposed to be there. The feeling of cold lingered in the car, pressing against my skin in patches, like someone had left an open freezer door somewhere nearby. I adjusted the air conditioning even though I knew it wasn't on. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I hesitated before turning off the car. The porch light was on, casting familiar shadows against my front door, but for the first time in years, my own home felt foreign, like I wasn't sure I'd be alone when I stepped inside. I took a deep breath, told myself I was being irrational, and forced my legs to move. But the moment I shut the car door behind me, I felt it again, just for a split second, the icy fingers brushing against the back of my neck. I ran inside and slammed the door. I locked it, deadbolt and all, heart racing. I stood there in my living room, listening. Nothing. No footsteps, no creaking floorboards, just the hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the clock. Normal sounds, safe sounds, and yet my skin was still cold where it had touched me. My breath still felt too shallow. I barely slept that night. I lay in bed, every nerve on edge, waiting, but nothing else happened. After that day, I never felt that touch again. The days passed, then weeks, and eventually, the memory of that night faded into the background of my mind. Sometimes, in moments of quiet, I recall the sensation, those icy fingers pressing against my skin, but I never experienced it again. Whatever had reached for me that night, it had let me go. And for that, I am grateful. It was a quiet evening when I found myself driving down a desolate country road, the kind that stretches endlessly between patches of thick forest and fields shrouded in mist. The sun had set hours ago, leaving only the pale glow of my headlights to cut through the darkness. The radio signal was weak, dissolving into static between songs, and the only sound accompanying me was the steady hum of the engine. It was the type of night where silence presses in from all sides, making even the smallest noise feel like an intrusion. I had taken this route before, though not often. It was a shortcut between towns, a road that locals warned about for reasons that never seemed fully explained. Whispers of accidents, disappearances, strange lights in the woods. I never put much stock in those stories. Roads were roads, and superstitions were for people who had nothing better to do than scare themselves. But that night, something changed. Something made me understand why people spoke of this place in hushed tones. It started with the feeling. A prickling at the back of my neck, the kind of sensation that makes you check your rearview mirror, even though you know no one is there. My hands tightened on the steering wheel, my pulse quickening for no reason I could name. The road stretched on, dark and empty, but it felt as if something was watching me, following me. I glanced at the speedometer. I wasn't going slow, but an unease crept in, urging me to go faster. Then the lights appeared. At first I thought they were the headlights of another car in the distance, cresting a hill behind me. But they were too high, too erratic. They flickered, shifting between soft glows and sharp bursts, moving in an unnatural rhythm. I checked my mirrors again, squinting, but the lights didn't behave like normal headlights. They darted side to side, disappearing and reappearing as if something or someone was playing a game with them. I pressed my foot against the accelerator. The trees on either side blurred past, the road narrowing in my mind as my focus locked onto the lights behind me. I told myself it was just another driver, maybe someone messing around. But deep down, something gnawed at me, a whisper of fear that I couldn't shake. Then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, the lights were gone. I exhaled, a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, and eased off the gas. Maybe it had been a trick of the light, some kind of optical illusion from the trees and the mist. Maybe I was letting my imagination get the better of me. But just as the rational part of my brain tried to take over, something else happened. The car's interior lights flickered. The radio crackled with sudden jarring static. A deep electric hum filled the cabin, vibrating through my bones. Then the engine sputtered, once, twice, and died. Panic surged through me as the car rolled to a stop, the steering stiff in my hands. The headlights dimmed, leaving me in near total darkness. I turned the key, but the engine refused to turn over. My breath came in short, uneven gasps as I fumbled with my phone. No signal. Of course. The silence that followed was different from before. It was absolute. No rustling leaves, no chirping insects, no distant rumble of an approaching vehicle. Just a vacuum of sound, as if the world itself had paused. Then the air changed. A cold wave swept through the car, a deep, unnatural chill that bit through my clothes and into my skin. It carried the scent of something old, metallic, like rusted iron or blood long dried. My fingers trembled as I gripped the wheel, my mind screaming at me to do something, anything, but I was frozen. And then I saw them. Not figures, not people, but shapes. Shadows that weren't cast by any light, moving outside my car, shifting just beyond the edges of my vision. They didn't have faces, at least none that I could make out, but I could feel their presence pressing in. I don't know how long I sat there staring, heart hammering against my ribs. Seconds, minutes, an eternity. Then, just as suddenly as everything had started, it was over. The car's engine roared back to life without me touching the key. The headlights blinked on. The radio returned to its normal static-filled murmuring. The air warmed as if nothing had happened at all. But something had happened. I knew it had. And as I sped away from that place, tires screeching against the asphalt, I refused to look in the rearview mirror. I don't take that road anymore. I never will. Some nights when I drive alone, I think I see lights in the distance, flickering in that same unnatural way. I tell myself it's my imagination, just lingering paranoia from that night. But deep down I know the truth. I wasn't alone on that road.